So, when most people think about gold, what comes to mind? Usually it's safety, right? Like rock solid.
Absolutely. That's the image, the ultimate safe haven, something you hold on to when things get shaky.
Yeah, the hedge against inflation, the thing that, well, people assume only goes up. The last resort.
And look, that perception isn't wrong exactly. It's built on a really long history. Gold has been a store of value, especially in rough times.
It feels like that anchor.
It does. But the materials we're looking at today, they paint a, let's say, more complicated picture.
Right, because it shows that while gold can be that safe haven, the price doesn't just, go in one direction, straight up.
No, it absolutely doesn't. Gold prices can drop, and they have, sometimes quite dramatically and for long stretches.
History's pretty clear on that, isn't it?
Very clear. There are some significant periods where gold prices just went down, challenging that simple safe haven idea.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We're going to really dig into why gold prices fall. We'll look at the surprising impact of government actions, big world events.
And also what happened historically to people who actually held gold when the government stepped in with restrictions. That's a key part.
Yeah, definitely want to cover that. And then, the big question, if it falls, how long does it really take to bounce back? Based on history, anyway.
Exactly. We'll use the sources you've provided to sort of guide us through these ups and downs, understand the real forces at play.
Okay, let's jump in. We get it. Gold, inflation hedge, safe haven, that's core. But the material insists its price moves. It fluctuates. It's not like fixed.
And sometimes it moves down for a really long time.
Yeah.
The classic example, maybe the most startling, is that huge bear market after the inflation-adjusted peak in January 1980.
1980, okay.
Yeah. And this wasn't just a quick dip in recovery. It was almost 20 years, a two-decade grind downwards. It bottomed out around $253 an ounce, nominally, in 1999.
Wow. 20 years. So if you bought at the peak in 1980.
You were waiting a very, very long time just to get back to not even counting inflation eroding value over those 2 decades. It really puts things in perspective.
Definitely does. So, okay, what are the general reasons the sources give for why gold might fall like that, or just fall in general?
Well, several big factors come up. One is just the overall health of the U.S. economy and, crucially, the strength of the U.S. dollar.
How does that work?
When the U.S. economy looks strong, growing, investors tend to feel, more optimistic. They might move money into things like stocks, looking for higher returns, less need for safety.
Okay, confidence goes up, gold demand maybe softens, and the dollar.
A stronger dollar is often bad news for gold.
Mhm.
Gold is priced in dollars globally, right? So if the dollar gets stronger, it just becomes more expensive for anyone buying with euros or yen or whatever.
So international demand gets dampened. Simple mechanics.
Exactly. Then you have central banks. Sometimes they decide to sell some of their gold reserves.
Why would they do that?
Various reasons, maybe rebalancing reserves, maybe needing funds. But if a big player starts selling, that increases the supply on the market. More supply, same demand. Price tends to go down.
Basic supply and demand.
Oh.
Okay. What else?
Interest rates. This is
Yeah.
a really big one, especially what the U.S. Federal Reserve does.
Right, because gold doesn't pay interest.
Precisely. It's a non-yielding asset.
Mm.
So when interest rates go up, things like bonds or even just savings accounts, they start looking much more attractive. They actually pay you something.
So the opportunity cost of holding gold goes up. You're giving up a yield you could be getting elsewhere.
You got it. That makes investors think twice about holding gold. And then, kind of related to the strong economy point, just general improved economic confidence around the world. If people feel less worried,
They need less insurance, less safe haven.
yeah, the urgency to buy gold for protection just isn't there as much.
Okay, so those are kind of the background economic forces, but the sources also point to something more direct, maybe even a bit more interventionist, government policy itself.
Yes, and this is where it gets really fascinating and maybe a bit uncomfortable for some gold proponents. Governments, especially via their central banks and monetary policy, can really push gold prices around.
So beyond just the general effect of rates going up, how does policy directly impact it?
Well, let's focus on those higher interest rates again for a sec. When the Fed hikes rates, it's a deliberate choice. They want to make other assets look better compared to non-yielding gold. It's part of managing the economy, guiding capital flow.
And that flow often goes out of gold.
Often, yes. And remember the dollar strength link. Higher U.S. rates tend to boost the dollar.
Right, making gold more expensive for foreign buyers.
Which again, hits demand. So you get this kind of double whammy sometimes from rising rates driven by policy.
And there was a fairly recent example of this mentioned.
Yeah, the sources point to 2013, 2014. Gold prices fell pretty sharply then, about 29% or so.
What was happening?
That was when the Fed started signaling it was going to taper its quantitative easing program, QE.
Right, QE was the big money injection after the financial crisis. So tapering meant
It meant they were going to slow down, reduce those asset purchases. It was the signal that the era of super easy money, ultra low rates was starting to end.
and the market reacted.
Oh, yeah. The dollar strengthened on that news, and the market anticipated future rate hikes. Both were bad for gold, hence the price drop. It shows even just signaling a policy change can have a big impact.
So even just unwinding emergency stuff hits gold. What about fiscal policy? Government spending, taxes, does that matter?
It's maybe less direct than the Fed's actions, but yeah, it's relevant. If fiscal policies lead to a really strong, stable economy with low inflation.
People feel secure, less need for gold, like the 90s.
Exactly. The sources use the 1990s as an example. General prosperity, high confidence, not much perceived need for a safe haven. That contributed to gold's weakness during much of that decade.
Okay, so those are the, let's call them indirect influences. But then the material gets into some really direct historical government actions, like hands-on stuff.
Yeah, this is where the history gets really stark. It challenges that idea of gold being totally separate from government control. Governments have, at times, stepped in very directly.
During the gold standard era, for instance.
Absolutely. Take the U.S. Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The government had just required citizens to turn in their gold. We'll get to that. But then with this act, they just declared, by law, that the official price of gold was now $35 an ounce. It had been $20.67 for ages.
So they just changed the price by decree.
Pretty much. A direct government action setting the value relative to the dollar. Not a market move.
And then later, Nixon in 71.
Right, the Nixon shock. He ended the dollar's convertibility into gold for foreign governments.
Yeah.
Basically cut the last tie of the Bretton Woods system.
What did that do to gold prices initially?
Initially, gold surged. Because the fixed price was gone, it could float freely. But the longer-term effect was crucial. It meant U.S. monetary policy was totally freed from needing to keep enough gold to back the dollar.
So the Fed could later jack up interest rates really high, like
Yeah.
in the early 80s, without worrying about the gold price link.
Exactly. That freedom allowed policies that ended up crushing the gold price later on, like those super high real interest rates under Volcker used to fight inflation. No gold constraint anymore.
Wow. Okay, this history of direct intervention is, well, it's something. It leads right into what the sources describe about governments actually acquiring gold, restricting it.
Yeah, and this is maybe the most critical history for someone thinking gold is untouchable, because governments have taken steps, especially in crises or wartime, to get their hands on gold.
The big U.S. example being Executive Order 6102, 1933, middle of the Depression.
That's the one. President Roosevelt signed it. It basically made it illegal for private citizens, individuals and companies to hoard gold. Hoarding was the term used.
What did they have to do? Just hand it over?
Essentially, yes. They were ordered to deliver most gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates they held to the Federal Reserve or a member bank.
And if you didn't, the sources mention some really harsh penalties.
Oh, they were incredibly severe, designed to make people comply, no question.
Like actual jail time.
Up to 10 years in prison.
10 years and fines.
Big ones. Up to $10,000, which you have to remember in 1933, money was enormous. The sources estimate that's like, what, $240,000 or more in today's dollars?
Ouch. Especially during the Depression.
Exactly. And you could face both the fine and the prison time. Plus, they could confiscate the gold itself.
Confiscate it and then
potentially fine. You double the value of the gold they took, so you lose the gold and pay twice its worth. Extremely punitive measures.
So people turned in their gold. How were they paid?
They got the official price at the time. $20.67 per troy ounce. It was framed as a required sale.
But wait, we just said that price changed soon after?
Right. That's the kicker. Shortly after they collected all this private gold, the 1934 Act bumps the official price up to $35 an ounce.
So if you followed the law and turned in your gold,
The dollars you got were suddenly worth about 40% less in terms of gold, according to the government's new price. It was a massive devaluation for those who complied.
were there any exceptions? Could anyone keep any gold?
A few limited ones. Small amounts, like under $100 face value in coins, which is about 5 ounces. Also, gold needed for industry or art dentists, jewelers, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And importantly, there was an exception for rare and unusual coins valuable to collectors.
Ah. Is that why pre-1933 gold coins are still around and legal to own?
That's exactly right. That numismatic exception is key. It allowed those older coins with collector value to escape the order.
Okay, so the penalties were severe. But did everyone actually comply? How effective was the enforcement?
Well, the sources suggest it relied a lot on people doing it voluntarily or self-reporting. While the penalties were scary, actual prosecutions, especially of just regular individuals, seem to have been relatively few compared to how much gold was thought to be out there.
So people probably just hid it,
Uh,
stashed it away.
That's the widespread belief, yes. Many likely took the risk, hid their gold, maybe buried it, hoping the rules would change later. The fact that pre-33 coins still exist in large numbers kind of backs that up. Enforcement seemed tougher on dealers, people handling larger amounts.
And the reason for doing this in 1933, was it about war brewing?
Not directly war at that moment, but the Great Depression was an existential crisis. The idea was to get all the gold into government hands to stabilize the banks, break deflation, and give the government control over the monetary base.
So shoring up the system.
Exactly. And having those massive gold reserves centrally controlled was definitely seen as vital for national economic stability and, yeah, for funding massive future efforts like World War II, which wasn't that far off. Those reserves were a huge asset during the war.
And this wasn't just a U.S. thing, right? Other governments have taken gold, too.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention Nazi Germany systematically looting gold from occupied countries and victims to fund their war machine, using neutral countries like Switzerland to trade it. And back in World War I, many countries stopped letting people swap currency for gold or export it, precisely so the governments could hoard gold to buy war supplies from abroad.
Man, this historical context is it's pretty sobering. It really drives home that gold ownership hasn't always been sacrosanct when governments feel pressured.
It definitely adds a layer you have to consider, beyond just market fluctuations, the idea that it's completely beyond state reach. History says otherwise, sometimes.
Which brings us around to the big question for anyone holding gold or thinking about it. If the price does drop significantly, how long does history suggest it might take to recover?
Yeah, the $1,000,000 question, or maybe the $2,000 an ounce question now. But the sources are really clear here. There's no set answer, no magic number of years.
It just varies.
Hugely. It depends entirely on why it dropped and what happens next in the economy, with policy, geopolitics. Yeah. Truly unpredictable.
No guarantees. But history must show us some examples, some range.
It does show a massive range.
Yeah.
On one extreme, you have that 1980 peak we talked about. It took almost 20 years for the nominal price just to get back to where it was, not even adjusting for inflation.
20 years. That's potentially devastating for an investment plan.
It's an incredibly long time to wait. But then look at the other side. During the 2008 financial crisis, gold initially plunged hard, maybe 28% in the panic.
Okay.
But then from that bottom in late 2008, it just roared back. It gained something like 163% in less than 3 years, hitting that peak above $1,900 in August 2011.
Wow. So a plunge followed by a massive, relatively quick surge.
A much, much faster recovery in that instance. But then after that 2011 peak,
Fell again?
yeah, it fell significantly again, dropping almost 45% to a low in late 2015. And climbing back from that low took several years again. It didn't just snap back instantly.
So it's really all over the map. The recovery speed depends completely on the context.
Totally. The sources circle back to the same factors. What's monetary policy doing? Loose or tight? How's economic confidence? Are there geopolitical crises? What's the dollar doing? Inflation fears. All those things that cause declines also dictate the pace of any recovery.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. What we've seen in this deep dive is, first, the simple idea that gold only goes up is, well, just not supported by history. Prices can and do fall.
Sometimes for very long stretches. And the reasons are complex. It's economics, it's global events, and critically, it's government policy, sometimes indirect, like with interest rates.
And sometimes incredibly direct, like we saw with historical restrictions, even confiscation, effectively.
Right. And then if prices do fall, history tells us the recovery time is, frankly, anyone's guess. Could be relatively quick after a crisis shock. Could be decades. No guarantees at all.
So, considering this history, especially those times, governments stepped in so forcefully and adding in the sheer unpredictability of how long a downturn might last. How does all that historical reality make you think about gold's role today? Does it challenge that ultimate safe haven idea for you? Or maybe reinforce